Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to this interview today. I'm joined with Scarlett Needham. Hello, Scarlett.
Hi everybody. Hi Jenny. Hope you're okay.
Thank you for joining us. Scarlett is a sensory integrated occupational therapist, and she works at Connect Therapy Services. I've got that right, haven't I?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's quite a long one, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. And Scarlett and I have already met through my own personal circumstances and my son's personal circumstances, because in my area, we don't have a sensory integrated trained occupational therapist under the CCG. And, you know, Joseph has been diagnosed as an autistic person for about 3 years now. And it has become very clear to me that a lot of his sensory differences, or all of his sensory differences, have not been assessed. And therefore support hasn't been put in place in order to be able to identify where he struggles. And so I approached my local authority and evidenced the need for them to commission somebody in, and that person was Scarlett. And I researched the services that you offered, and I was really impressed. I had an idea of what I was looking for. So I researched your services and we made contact, and then the assessment has been agreed. So you've done the first half of the assessment.
Yes, yep.
Haven't you, Scarlett? And then the second half of the assessment is going to be done within school, which leads me on. What is the difference between an occupational therapist and a sensory integrated occupational therapist?
Yes, I think this is a question that I guess many people ask, but we're still first and foremost, I'm an occupational therapist. So our kind of belief and our training through occupational therapy at university is we, as all occupational therapists, believe in kind of meaningful occupation, what is important for the individual, for the young person and the child. That is still our background as still occupational therapists, and kind of that underpins everything we do. But obviously kind of from universities doing occupational therapy, we all start to specialise. So people that I have trained with in OT, some may be in falls prevention, so some may be in stroke rehabilitation in older adults, and you just start to specialise in different areas, but our background as still occupational therapists. So I guess with the sensory integration kind of therapy, on top of that, it's just specialist training, which then we would look into, is any sensory processing difficulties impacting on the child, the young person or the adult, on their ability to participate or engage in what's meaningful to them. So it is just, we're still occupational therapists, we never give up that title, but it's just a different specialist area that then where we have trained and looked into, and then what underpins our kind of therapy thereafter as well. Does that make sense? Because we have still got our OT hats on.
Yeah, no, it does. That's really informative. Thank you. So in terms of your knowledge, your specialist knowledge, where did you come to the point of deciding that you wanted to specialise in that particular area?
So this is when I start to feel a bit older, but I've always taught dancing. Dancing back in the day as I was growing up was kind of a bit of my life. Very passionate dancer back in the day and used to teach as well. So I guess even back then, I was gravitated towards, I probably wasn't even aware of it back in the early years, that I was just naturally supporting children probably with dyspraxia, possibly sensory difficulties, then motor coordination, like balance coordination was quite poor. But I, for whatever reason, even when during my kind of younger years, just gravitated to supporting these children. And that's kind of where my passions just started. I then managed, you know, when you have year 10 kind of practice placements, went to one of our local special schools. And that was where my kind of passion for it just came. I absolutely loved it. Like, I just could not imagine not being an occupational therapist now. And it was just back in the one of the special schools, just having that time with an occupational therapist and seeing what they did and how they were always including the child and the family, always wanted to know what was important to them, how could we support you. And that, I think, for me was just what I absolutely loved. So yeah, it started quite early, and so straight away from leaving school, went to university to do occupational therapy. So it was always there. I'm very lucky that with Bernardo's, where we used to work, where I've previously worked, I was able to just start with some more training, and that's where the doors opened to do sensory integration therapy. And I was very, very, very lucky that that opportunity arose. And I
So it was meant to
never
be.
looked back. Yes,
So it was meant to be.
it was meant to be, and I just, I guess I could never imagine not doing anything else.
So when you see a child and a referral comes in, and you know that you're going to be observing the child, young person, adult, whatever the circumstances is it something that you are particularly looking for? Is there 3 or 4 starter points that you have in your head that you are particularly looking for that might stand out straight away, or you have to know that you have to dig a bit deeper and then it presents itself? What are they? Is there kind of
and we'll come on a bit later into one of the questions, but I think initially when our referrals come through, many people probably still perceive sensory as light and auditory. And yes, that definitely encompasses like kind of the sensory processing difficulties. But one of the areas is starting to look at that very early infancy as well, like your developmental, kind of, is there any developmental delays, our motor skills as well. So that for us is an area that you will start questioning as well. And I think during the clinic assessment specifically, it is very motor based. It's very, how are we responding? How are we doing something? And sometimes the coping strategies for the child or the young person that has developed from that. So are they using a language to opt out, or are they rushing, kind of maybe how are they speaking? So we'll start to notice as well those kind of strategies that a child may have developed, and they're kind of what we're sometimes looking at. We naturally need to see them occur. So we'll sometimes step back and let them naturally occur as well during the clinic kind of assessment, or when we're speaking to a family. So it's, although we want to see or not see, but know of and understand kind of some of the behavioural difficulties, some of the areas we'll look at as well is how are they doing something? Are they opting out of something? And they're very important for us to know as well.
So when you say opting out, is that a different way of saying choosing not to do it, or masking by presenting themselves a certain way because they're not wanting to expose themselves to that because it feels uncomfortable?
And I think there's words that I really don't like, what many people may use, things like manipulative, and I always think where we as humans, it's survival, isn't it? We develop coping strategies. Each and every one of us develop coping strategies to get by. And I'm not being manipulative. I just can't do something. And actually, if I choose not to, then I might not fail. I might not feel failure. It might be too overwhelming, so I'm reducing it beforehand. So I believe that the children or young people, we and us ourselves, we develop coping strategies to not to mask or to feel comfortable or to get by. I agree that that's where coping strategies are developed from. But unfortunately, we tend to, as a society, have labelled some of these behaviours as such. As manipulative or disruptive, or
it's around that narrative, isn't it? And that's something that I've discussed actually in another video, and the main focus of that video is the narrative that I suppose neurotypical people get into the habit of saying when they're describing other children.
Yeah.
And it's not, as a parent that's reading those assessments, it can actually feel very personal. I don't feel that they're actually talking about the same child, because they're misinterpreting the behaviour as being manipulative or refuse, won't engage, he needs to do this or she needs to do that. And we're almost putting those societal expectations on a child or young person, but actually it's not about choice. They just can't access that environment because physically it feels, you know, painful.
It's painful, it's a negative experience. And I would say we wouldn't as adults choose to do something that we're uncomfortable or unable to do. We would choose not to, and we've got the communication to say that. And I think we've got to look at that and support a young person who is having those difficulties. How are we going to either help them or kind of change the activity or change that day to enable them to reach their optimum ability in things that they really do want to or need to do, and what's important to them as well, what's meaningful to them. And
it's around that, you know, the coping mechanisms, the toolkit. I mean, as adults, when I am having a day, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, as we all do, whether we're on the spectrum. I know, you know, some could say we're all on the spectrum somewhere, aren't we? You know,
we all feel overwhelmed. We're all,
and I have the tools to be able to know what to do, because I've reached an age where I've learned. But when we look at children and young people, there's a lot of responsibility that we tend to put on their shoulders when they haven't got the tools.
From such a young age as well now. I think the behavioural expectation from such a young age, and emotionally, these children aren't ready to take on so much demands. And I think, that's the behaviour is going to be seen. I even reflect on my own. So I think they've got to go to school. They've got to do this. They've got to do that. They're not allowed to be children anymore or be themselves. And I think we've become very limited in what we're able and allowed to do for ourselves, haven't we?
One of the things that I found really, really interesting when we visited your clinic, which I must say was really impressive, and I was really surprised around all of the equipment. You know, in terms of the suspension of the ceiling and what you were looking for in terms of Joseph and how he presents. And one of the things that I found really interesting was in terms of his communication. And how he gives instructions. And so Joseph is very animated, and, you know, he has given me full permission to discuss him. He loves to be discussed, and he with it. You know, and what I found really interesting was that, and I was impressed that you were looking for it as well, because he does do this, but I was impressed that you were particularly looking for it, is that when you was asking him to go around the assault course, but then you asked him to instruct you. Go around the assault course by not showing any body movement, but by voice only. So voice only, giving you those instructions, but he had to stand still. He found that really, really difficult. Why was that?
There can be multitude of reasons, but obviously we're looking at communication. So again, and kind of, I'm not a speech and language therapist, but communication in terms of, we look at the praxis side as well. So that kind of ability to have an idea, you plan and organise it, and you execute it. But it's really good to look at many of our children, they love to move. They do everything by moving. So when you're then in a school environment where you've got to do everything sat down, you've lost that kind of kinesthetic kind of learning, that moving. So we're kind of looking at, if we're not doing all that moving and that kinesthetic learning, are we going to find it difficult to sit at a desk and do X, Y, and Z instructions? So for the children and young people, it's again, every kind of assessment is slightly different, because each child is different, each young person is different, and you gauge it, what you can include within the assessment. For many of our children, we wouldn't have been able to ask, right now you give us the instructions, but it's really good to look at that kind of praxis side of that planning and organisation. Can he do it when he's not moving around?
And it's going back to the processing then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes, you know, with some of the children that I've worked with in the past, and I've heard other adults that have said, give me the eye contact, because again, it's about societal norms, putting those expectations on. But yes, the child might be able to give you the eye contact, but then they've lost the processing.
Because I'm having to focus so much on this one aspect.
Yes.
And for many children, it is, we'll support them to do, right, we've got difficulties at planning an organisation, but is that where we include the visuals, or do we include moving and learning through kind of that kinesthetic learning as well? And for many of our children, they do need to move as they learn. I mean, you've probably seen already, I'm like, I'm quite a kinesthetic. That's probably why I'm an OT. I can't sit at a desk. I move continuously. There's a reason we probably go into our jobs and our roles. But yeah, it's looking at those different elements. Many of our children might just go off and they do everything, but they're flitting from idea to idea. So that's why we kind of look at those obstacle courses is, can we really structure that, have an idea, structure it and follow it through and then execute it? So there's different elements of that praxis stage. And I think this is kind of where the sensory processing difficulties we are. I suppose it is still quite a buzzword, still sensory. And I think the expectation is the light rooms, you know, kind of that calming lighting, messy play. And it's not, a lot of it is to do about kind of that praxis side, being able to develop ideas, plan it, follow it through, and how that also supports that regulation as well.
So when parent carers generally come to you, do you find that it's a mix? So some parents will come to you and they'll know a little bit. Some parents will come to you and they've got no knowledge or understanding whatsoever, you know, and what is the level of understanding by the time parents come to you in general? And do they give you feedback in terms of, you know, your input when they've read your report? What kind of feedback do you get in general?
It's very different on each child and young person that we've supported, and again, possibly because of where the referrals come from, and I suppose that is quite for each area. This is not even just within across, I'm obviously in East Riding, but in each local authority at the moment, there's no just kind of here's your sensory service. So it is still a developing area, and as to how we get referrals. So it is quite a mixture. We have many young people who, unfortunately, it's not assessed until it's crisis. So it's been missed for many, many years. There's been some identification of difficulties, but never addressed. And it could be age 14, 15, and unfortunately it's crisis or risk of exclusion, school refusal, as we call them. But unfortunately it's become crisis, and then a referral has been put in because it appears to be some sensory processing difficulties. So some families, they've got very little knowledge, unfortunately. And again, I think it is still a growing area. I think it's more widely known and understood now, but it is still a growing area,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think from a personal perspective, you know, when my son received his diagnosis, and I've always known, you know, for us, it was kind of, there wasn't really anything available in terms of pathways.
It's the pathway,
you know, and there wasn't anything to, you know, he has this diagnosis of autism. However, we're not commissioned to do anything further than a sensory profile. Nothing was ever suggested to me. So I think, you know, because of my job anyway, I had a little bit of background.
And I think it's that knowing where to look as well. I think once you start researching sensory, it's vast.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite huge. I think, although it's an area that nobody seems to be really understanding, or it's developing, but it's still quite an unknown area. Actually, when you start researching, the information is vast and then very difficult to unpick. It is like being a detective, and it's quite sometimes difficult to unpick and to work out, because for many of our children, again, like ourselves, we can fluctuate. We can go from being under to over responsive. We can have one sensory system that's working on over, or one sensory system that's working on under. And that can, again, that fluctuates daily, because other kind of challenges can impact on it, such as sleep, such as school, such as transitions. So it becomes quite complex when you then start looking into it and thinking, yeah, we've got an auditory, could be auditory sensitive, they're putting the hands under over their ears, but actually, are they over responsive, or do they like the vibration of it? Some of them will start perking behind their ears, and it then becomes you're unpicking other kind of differences or difficulties or environments. So yeah, I think it's quite a hard area just to navigate as a parent. I think it is quite
and I think
challenging.
One of the things, most of the information that I've been able to unpick has actually been from autistic people themselves.
Yes, yeah.
You know, I am, you know, my child is autistic and he's still very much learning about himself.
Yeah.
You know, so every knowledge that I have is because he's informing me all the time.
And that's so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when I've gone to look for other information, I've actually gone to autistic adults, because they've been through their childhood. They're probably at a much better place where they know themselves and have a really good understanding of their own sensory difference and how other people in the past that maybe not supported them in comparison to how they're able to live their lives in the present. So I think that is really, really useful. And there's a guy called Andy Smith, and his knowledge, I mean, his knowledge is going to be amazing, because he's an autistic adult, and I get most of my information and advice from him. You know, and I think that's a really sensible way of doing things, because he has a real understanding.
Yeah, and I think when we give recommendations, it's trial and error. There's no right or wrong way, because we're all individual and we all have our own sensory preferences. And I think we've got to respond to what they like or dislike, because it is trial and error. What I like is going to be different to what you like or dislike. And I don't think us just saying this is like, you've got to use a weighted blanket. Well, if somebody's going, get it off me, we respond to that as well. And that's we think, no, just because it's telling us it's calming, if somebody does not like it, you don't kind of then force it onto them. No. You've got to respect. It is trial and error, and that's, I think, what's quite a difficult area with sensory, because there's no clear cut kind of this works, this doesn't work. It is trial and error. You've got to respond. You've got to kind of map it out, and that's why I think we do review quite often, as much as possible. Generally, like half-termly, quarterly, is to have these conversations with parents, with teachers, with the children and young people themselves, if possible, to get their feedback. What do you like? Does that work? What time of the day does it work? Where best do we put the equipment? Or kind of, I think it's just gaining that feedback. And
that brings me on to the next question really beautifully. So do you ever receive any feedback from the professionals themselves in terms of, you know, if they've, supposing a child in a classroom and for such a long time the child has presented, you know, quite negative behaviour or what seems negative behaviour because the needs aren't being met, and then all of a sudden the needs have been identified, you've done a report, recommendations have been put in place, and then all of a sudden the child's needs are being met and everything's well in the world. Do you ever get that feedback?
I think it's a journey. I think it's definitely a journey. And again, it's very dependent on what we're able to deliver, because with being independent, parents may only be able to afford an assessment, so sometimes that is being unable to continue, kind of the actual intervention, any reviews, the sensory diet in place, training and things like that. The ones where we're able to get it as much as possible kind of through the EHC plans, etc., and where we're able to deliver direct therapy, we as much as possible have teachers, the TAs, and the parents actually within the therapy with us. And I believe that having that team and continuously, I'm looking at the clinic's over there. Start to realise people can't actually see where you are.
Okay.
The clinic.
Yeah.
But we always, as much as possible, have a teacher with us or the parent with us. It might be different kind of each week, depending on the needs of the child and the young person. But having all of us as part of the intervention, I feel, is what is most influential and the kind of positive impact thereafter.
Yeah.
If we're able to, again, if it's part of it's hard when it becomes part of a package through EHC, the plans, training is a huge, I think, being able to train teachers, TAs, parents to upskill and not just make everybody more knowledgeable about it and empowering them. I think that again is very influential on how successful it is. 100%. And then where possible, reviews where we go and meet up again. We'll go to school to see, is there anything that needs to be changed, what's going wrong, what's going well, is there anything we can look at that needs changing. So yeah, and again, this is all depending on if it's part of an EHC plan and we can actually continue with that input, as is a lot of things, I guess, but that's where as much as possible we feel the most positive outcomes are developed, and when we're working as a team.
Yeah, I think when everybody's working together, team around the child, child-centered, ultimately it's going to benefit everybody. More importantly, the child in the center. But there is a big emphasis on education in terms of EHCPs when there shouldn't be, because it's supposed to be
each impact.
But health must come before education, and sensory difference and all of that encompasses what it is to be healthy. So health always, and then hopefully those foundations and understanding are there, then learning will come, but it must be health first. And I do think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding around that, and a focus sometimes on the HCPs around education.
It's just education, and none of us can learn without our emotional, our mental well-being first, and our physical health, obviously. But I agree is that our well-being, if we're not feeling okay, then you're unable to process the learning information. None of us can. So I totally understand and agree is it becomes an education, however the health is inhibiting or impacting on them being able to access the education.
And I think education can be seen in lots of different ways. It's not just about education, isn't just about sitting at a desk, is it?
No. Oh gosh, no, we can.
If we look at life skills and how important life skills are, and important for children to be able to access life. So we go back to those values and what it feels to be healthy, to be part of the community.
And what's important to you. Definitely. And probably as an occupational therapist, that's where we definitely are passionate about is life skills. That's definitely our
What I was going to ask you is, would you like to see any advances in terms of knowledge around sensory differences and available resources? What would you like to see in the future?
My first and foremost would be to not be a plaster service. and to really focus on early intervention. I feel there's kind of correlation between many children kind of being left or unmet needs, and until it's reached crisis, whether that's kind of the mental well-being, being unable to kind of go to school anymore, the kind of the environmental impact on it. I feel many of our children are unable to access services until they've reached that crisis point. And by that point, as we probably many of us know, it's more difficult, it's more challenging to then support those kind of underlying needs, because they've been encompassed, kind of entwined with the anxiety, feeling of failure, your self-esteem, your self-worth. That's more difficult for any of us, isn't it? And I would love to see in the future that early intervention is really focused again.
And it's around making the most, and I've spoken about this around my own personal circumstances in trying to access support, is that there's a window of opportunity when children are young.
Well, that's when everything it's when everything is developing. Their emotional regulation is developing at that age, their skills are developing at that age.
And in terms of trauma, you know, we see a lot of children that have trauma that is external to their diagnosis because of unmet need, will actually, you know, economy, you know, in terms of funding, will end up costing more in the long run anyway. And so you're still going to have to make that cost, but it'll be on the other side when it's become
when it's, and it's if you're going into an environment every day that, even for us as adults, is detrimental to your well-being. If you go into work each day and there's bullying, or you're going into an environment that's very overwhelming every day, there's no reason. There's a reason why I enjoy working by myself in because I get overwhelmed by big places. But as an adult, I've been able to choose that I don't go into a work environment that's hundreds, thousands, really. If you look at high schools, can be up to thousands of children. I've chosen that I don't go into an environment that's not going to fit comfortably with myself. And kind of, but if I was forced to do that every day, it would impact on my well-being. But many of our children and young people continuously have to go through that. And it's a negative experience. It keeps building on itself, doesn't it, to trauma.
And it goes back to that self-care. As adults, we learn to give ourselves self-care. As children, there is that element of other professionals having a duty of care. Having a duty of care to be able to provide a safe environment. You know, to me, it does come down to safeguarding at times. You know, and we have all of the SEND regulations underpinning all of that. You know, they are there for a reason. And it's just such a shame that, you know, that you've identified that most of the time, because of the lack of awareness and the lack of knowledge, and sometimes the lack of funding, you know, we're meeting those needs at crisis point. You know, we need to be getting there much earlier on. So I have got some questions for you from some parents. So if you don't mind, I'd like to point those questions out to you.
You're more than welcome to.
All right, one of the questions. A parent has a 7-year-old with SPD, so sensory processing disorder, ADHD, and has a recent thing, and this is relative to the vibration comment that you made earlier, has a recent thing for purging his bottom on the washing door whilst it's spinning and making a constant noise so he can hear his voice vibrate as well. Would a vibration plate give him feedback? He folds himself in half, which mum feels isn't good for his spine. So that's why she's thinking a vibration plate would be better. He's recently started back at mainstream school after a 12-month break, looking for a way to self-regulate himself.
Right, that is, and again, it is as we touched on earlier, it is like being a detective, so it's really difficult to give clear advice, I guess, when we don't know the full picture of when are they what is the reasoning for the need for self-regulate, when is it occurring, is it just when the kind of washing machine is on, or is he switching the washing machine on to get that vibration himself? And probably the difficulty with me giving just pure advice kind of through this way is that if you just put a kind of vibration plate in the home, there could also be a chance that it could overstimulate him as well.
Yeah.
So it is a balance that you'd need more of an understanding of the young person. But something that could possibly just be put in place is, if we're always feeling that to kind of divert, there's vibration cushions that you could maybe use just to divert at the moment. So he's getting that squeeze as well. So if he does like bending over, you can get some good vibration cushions, and once you give it a good squeeze, the vibration comes on. So that may possibly just as kind of an initial start point is to try and divert to the vibration cushion, and if you can squeeze it into his tummy instead of kind of the going over onto the washing machine. But again, that is just a quick advice without understanding the context of things.
So if you have a child that's looking for that input, and we mentioned that the vibration plate, now I've not heard of vibration plates before, and you mentioned a vibration cushion, so would you recommend sourcing them from a particular place? Is it generally for children that are looking for that specific type of input? What can you give us a little bit more information around that?
On the equipment itself, or where to get it from? Or there's many resources to go through.
Okay.
Trying to think. Obviously you've got your Amazon.
Right, okay.
And again, it's hard. I think it's hard for families. And obviously you've been to our clinic where we try also to use equipment that is affordable and available, because many things are very, very costly.
Yeah, so expensive.
Very expensive. And as we discussed earlier, it can be trial and error. Sometimes you use it once, twice, and the novelty is gone.
Yes.
Or we've not got it in the right place in the home. So actually, sometimes we tend to put all of our children's equipment up in the bedroom. But actually, if they're still needing you in proximity, do we need the piece of equipment, whether that's a dark den or a swing or something, where us as the family are, it's taking that into account as well. So again, equipment can be very costly. So sometimes just don't go off and buy the really expensive without kind of trialing it first.
There is an organisation in my area.
With a huge...
I know, as soon as you type in sensory, the price seems to go...
It's vast.
There is an organisation in my area, and it does actually rent. Free. And they come round and have a conversation with you, and sometimes
that's great.
Blankets, and the child has to wait themselves.
Definitely. And when to use it, how to use it.
Borrow that for free. And then you think, well, this is going to save a purpose.
Definitely. Because again, going back to the vibration plate, they are costly, very costly. And I wouldn't want to recommend, go off and buy one without, where do we put it? Where would the best place in the home to be? When would it be appropriate to use? Is it just straight away after school, or do they need it as they wake up in the morning, ready and preparing for school? So again, there's lots of factors alongside it. And you do want to trial it first. I've got that is something that works. Because
it's a little bit like buying clothes, isn't it? It's a little bit like buying clothes. Your top may look fantastic on you, but I might try it on and go, oh no, I don't like the feel of it. No, that's not very nice.
Exactly. And the equipment definitely is the same. And we give, and I think something actually that COVID has changed our probably way of working is the last year we've been able to continue with therapy, but however, with school closures and isolation, we haven't always been able to meet, kind of getting into the schools, or we've been able to do teams, but it's very different, isn't it? And something that we've been able to do is really get to know what the children and young people like first. And within the clinic, kind of more of the intervention side, and go, actually, this is something that they've really taken to. It's really helped them regulate. Now it would be a good and appropriate to put it in with the school or the home environment. And that has actually been really beneficial, because with firsthand being able to see that has worked. Now it's okay to go off and purchase or look at putting it in within the school or
so
home.
you've adapted your approach.
And actually it's worked out. Something positive came out of the COVID, but it was just because sometimes we go into schools first and we're starting putting that sensory diet in first. So they'll get a range of equipment, or at home parents might start buying things, but I think it's just really giving us time to look at what the children and young people really like, get their feedback first before actually putting it in the home environment, and when to use it.
And that's really important.
Really
important to embed that knowledge.
Definitely. And I think again, it's looking at, if a young person kind of needs that stimulation, that up regulator, we don't then put it in the home environment when that's more chill time, or giving that balance. Because again, you could go off and buy 5-10 pieces of equipment, put them in the home, and it's like, whoa, way too much, and that's overstimulated. And
I think the consistency is really, really important in terms of parental. I'm trying to be polite, because my husband's just on the other side of the door. But some of the strategies that he's used in terms of supporting Joseph, I felt have been inappropriate. And the same. So sometimes different parental strategies sometimes can be really harmful, and that consistency is very, very, very important. And I know that if, I mean, we're a lot better now because we've had to learn together, and it's been a long journey. So we're in a really healthy place now. I mean, nobody gives you a manual, do they?
Nope, I'm agreed with that.
Nobody gives you a manual.
Even with my two, you're definitely never given a manual.
No. But I know that when Josie's been at school all day, I know that when he needs to come home, he needs to just completely, if he moves himself from everybody, he goes up in his bedroom, and that's when he will self-regulate. And he has found different ways of self-regulating. So, I mean, some of the things that he does, other people might not see that as a self-regulation, but it calms him, it reduces his anxiety. So he's learned to self-regulate himself, and one of the ways is through singing. Now it might be in a foreign language. That's a self-taught. Self-taught. Writing on paper continuously. In a foreign language as well, and all of those things that might not appear to be self-regulation.
They are
self-regulation.
They really are.
Because
and for some of us, we don't need all the equipment. Sometimes having the equipment there is actually too much. Do we just need a hand-eye coordination activity, something that we can just completely draw into, and just switch the rest of the world off for a little bit, and that's okay. And I think it's lovely when, as individuals, we have our own strategies, and we've got to embrace them and accept them of each other as well. And
actually,
once we accept each other and projecting our own, this is what should be done. I'm like, actually, it's okay.
I think there's a lot of preconceived ideas about, what sensory difference looks like, what a sensory aid looks like, and lots of people trying to put people in boxes. I've got another question, because I don't want to run out of time. So another question is from a parent. Should this is a tricky one. Should OT sensory provision be in education, or health provision if specified in an EHCP?
I think we kind of touched on it earlier, didn't we? That I would say in my experience, they have been part of education because of the education barrier. And again, it's possibly because it has reached crisis point, and unfortunately, the young person is unable to attend school anymore, or kind of they've had to pull out of school. So it's been within education. But I think obviously we've touched on that. It's encompassed within health as well.
Yes.
I just possibly maybe in my area there may be other OTs out there who have had experience where it's been able to be put into health. Just within the areas that we seem to cover, it has only been into education. Personally, whether I'm speaking out of terms or not, but it does encompass health as well. On your growth, you find motor skills, there's still all your physical kind of health, your mental well-being, that is still your health. So yeah,
and if we look at the Children and Families Act 2014, you know, it was one of the elements is making sure that the EHCP is integrated.
Yep.
So it's seen as an integrated service.
Yep.
And not to be, well, that is just
health, and it should only have outcomes for education.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely,
Lovely.
in my experience within our area, it's SI is only being provided through education.
Yeah.
I don't personally see, yeah.
Depending on, you know, yeah.
I know.
Okay, question number 3. Do you feel there is a relationship between differences, and I know we've discussed this, differences between sensory integration and anxiety?
Oh God, yes, huge. Yeah. And again, for many different reasons. And I think each young person's reason is different, or their experience. Sensory processing, if you're going into an environment or something is occurring to you each day that's very negative, going outside into a very unpredictable world where a noise may startle you or people brushing by you, that's a very negative experience for a child, a young person. The more times that happens, the more times you may again not want to go out into that environment, because that's very highly anxiety provoking, isn't it? Going into somewhere you don't feel comfortable. The more times that may occur, your anxiety is going to increase, isn't it? And again, with kind of looking at that praxis side as well, many people may understand it more like with dyspraxia. But if you don't feel comfortable with your gross and fine motor skills, if you're in the PE class in year 2 and you can't catch a ball or play football as skilled as maybe your peers, your self-worth, your self-esteem, you're not going to want to kind of participate in that activity, even though you're forced to twice a week or however many times. So the more times you're kind of thrown in and thinking, whoa, I can't do this, and I've got an understanding of the other peers around me, their anxiety as they grow older and they know they maybe not be able to do things as skillful as their peers. I believe that many of the children, and there's lots of evidence out there as well. It's not just I believe, but that kind of, your self-esteem, your self-worth.
We're going back to those societal expectations, aren't we? And you know, we're also going back to the health principles. You know, the health principles. What is it to be healthy? Yes, we know that the basics are food, water, you know, going to the dentist, having a good night's sleep, all those things. But actually, to be healthy, to be happy, is so much more around that. You know, we are sensory beings. You know. And to feel valued, to feel accepted, to feel part of the community, to feel loved, to be loved, all those, you know, all those things that we all want as human beings is what it means to be healthy. Truly.
It does. It really, really does. And I always think kind of that link back to like your food and your water, etc. But if you don't feel kind of that accepted, that look how that then can impact on you wanting to eat food, and all those kind of internal systems as well. They combined, they're kind of in, you can't separate them really, can you? And
no, and sensory differences around food.
Yeah, that's
well.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Joseph has a very, very fixed idea around what he will
Yeah.
eat and what he won't eat. And it's a combination of about 4 different groups.
Yeah, again, it's never just sensory either. And I think that's where I think people, it's pure sensory, and it's like, wow, it's really not, we've got to look at the psychological effects, that impact and things as well. Yeah, they're very kind of
very complex.
Very complex, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so this is interesting. My daughter had an OT assessment 2 years ago, and a sensory profile was done. It was identified that she would benefit from an integrated plan, but nothing has been done, unfortunately. I think she's just wanting a plan B, or you know, nothing's been done. What would you recommend? What should her next move be?
Again, this is obviously I work in a slightly different area, as in locality area, but many of the families that we work with, probably more so kind of, I'm across the bridge, but it is kind of chasing through your local authority, using kind of you have Sendias and things, is kind of looking at those as well, and how they can support you to get things in place. There are obviously some other independent kind of areas to follow, like your Ehcp, or even on like Facebook, there's your sensory, I'm sure it's called Sensory Matters. I can always let you know off the top of my, can't remember what it's off the top of my head. But they've got really good advice as well of where to look to when these needs aren't being met, and maybe an assessment's being done, but we're unable to continue because that higher kind of within your Ehcp or the funding hasn't been agreed. But I can always send you the link afterwards. It was Sensory Integration Matters, I think it is. But they're really good at kind of giving advice as well, I think, on how to raise it even further as a concern.
I think if it was kind of, you know, me, I'm not an expert, but everything that I kind of talk about is always based on my own parental experiences. And in the past, if things have been identified, and the evidence is there, I've had to go through all the evidence, highlight the evidence, highlight what's been identified, and then link it to legislation. Because the legislation is there for a reason. And legislation and law always trumps policy. So I think it's really, really important that parents empower themselves and learn the SEN Code of Practice, learn the Families Act 2014, learn the Equality Act. But it's easier said than done when you're mentally exhausted.
It is. It's very difficult as well, isn't it? Of finding the time to, when you, as a parent, I guess you need to be there for your child as well, don't you? You've got to be. Your evenings, your mornings have to be spent regulating or supporting, coming home from school. It's hard, isn't it? Putting everything in place, and then during the day you might have to be chasing phone calls, and
it's very isolating. And I think for me, it's trying to explain to, you know, my wider members of my family and friends, you know, why sometimes these behaviours present, and always be the one that's expected to know everything. And there's lots of information readily available, but it's trying to find the sensible information. Because the internet's a wonderful thing, but sometimes
it is, but it's vast and
misinformation.
There's lots of misinformation, lots of things to pull apart, and it's
and making sure that your child's needs are individual to them, but making sure that your child's needs are met based around his individuality, and it's not just a general blanket report that sometimes can be copied and pasted, not individualized. And I'm really looking forward to, because I have a little bit of knowledge around sensory difference, but not enough for me to have a huge impact on, in Joseph's educational healthcare plan. So I'm really looking forward to the second half of your assessment and what you find, within his school, but also, what that's going to read like in the report and how then that's going to benefit him in his
practice. And again, it's when we do assessments, they're great, and it's obviously a huge part of the kind of the puzzle and a step forward. But sometimes it's really difficult. It is still a piece of paper, isn't it? It's the practical side of things that are the most beneficial. I think assessments have, obviously, we all know they have their place, and we need to do assessment first. But kind of ongoing from that is still almost, obviously, as OTs, we have the nice OT process, but is reviewing it and speaking to people and that is still part of our assessment. Even if we was to carry on with kind of intervention with a young person, we're still always learning and working out or changing or going, oh, what does this bit mean? Because it might not have been brought up in assessment just because it didn't occur or it was different a year ago or something like that. So it is that continuous process.
And it's about evaluation, isn't it?
Evaluating it,
and professional reflection. And making sure that, because as you've identified, sometimes, any report or an Ehcp can sometimes just be a piece of paper. It's actually the adults around that Ehcp that's reading it, understanding it, and implementing. It's the implementation,
the doing of it, doing, and and I think feeling it as well. Sensory is quite a doing kind of, I guess, thing. It's doing it and working alongside. That's when you start to feel it, and for the young people to feel it as well. And how does that feel? And for parents, kind of, it is challenging kind of working out a sensory diet. And I always say, even after like 10 years, 12 years now, it's still difficult to put a sensory diet in place and do it daily, because if you've had a poor sleep the night before, it's going to impact on your sensory input and your sensory threshold the next day. So what worked yesterday would generally work the day after. It's really difficult to put in place. It's just being able to have that reviewing process as well, and going, actually, how did it impact? What were the differences here? What was negative, or what was positive? And how can we keep on embedding that as well?
And it's understanding. We'll finish after this.
That's all right.
I appreciate we've been speaking for quite a while, but it's understanding that when a child is in for example, a mainstream classroom. And all the other children and parents are, cooing over the wonderful work that's on the wall, and the environment looks very colourful and it's busy and all the rest of it. Actually, for a child with sensory difficulties, it's a nightmare for them. It's a nightmare, and
it's something I always talk about in training with teachers. I reflect on the film Matilda. It's kind of, no, it's not off topic, but in the film Matilda, Miss Trunchbull, when she comes in, everything's down, it's plain, it's beige, and I'm like, that is so important. Actually, I'm like, actually, Miss Trunchbull, you actually did something really well then. But definitely, it's with the visuals. I go into assessing schools, and you sometimes, once people get to know me, I get distracted quite easily as well, and I am definitely a mover and need the input myself. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, these are little children as well. I'm like, their minds are not ready to process so many shapes, colours, shiny stuff, and it's like being a magpie and things on the window. And I'm like, if I, as a grown adult who's relatively okay with my sensory processing, if I can't tolerate it, and if I get distracted, how are our young people? Definitely. It's,
and I kind of imagine that's like a vibration, like a silent boo, 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 constantly being absorbed into the child's brain, and I can imagine it must be so distressing
Just
for them.
overwhelming.
It's something that the adults cannot see.
Yeah.
They can't see that's the distress.
Yeah.
And sometimes, this is definitely with Joseph, he can't express.
Yeah. That is what causing, this is too much. Yeah. Because at that point it just becomes overwhelming, and kind of that physiological effect inside is just either shut down or I need to self-regulate to block this out.
And it is a shame that I think that some of those external presentations, it might look wonderful, but actually sometimes it's for the benefit of outside visitors, and when Ofsted comes in, when actually who is it really benefiting?
And I always think just in classrooms, if you've got A to Z on the wall, all the numbers, all the displays, our minds are unable to, for one, well, there's a few reasons, we're unable to process all that obviously at one point, but I always remember speaking to a psychologist about this, is it becomes very, for many children as well, unimportant, because it's a bit like if we drove to work every day, we probably won't remember how we got to work, as in what signs you've seen, things that become your very everyday visual input. But if Mr. Blobby was on the roundabout with a sign, you'd remember that and you go, oh, because it's a change. And I say to teachers, with all the will in the world, with all this information, they can't home into what's important. If you're needing to look for a number, you can't home into it. But either changing it around or just limiting what you need and the important things being there, because it's just too much. The brain is shut down from it as well.
Well, I'm going to stop speaking now because you're going to be very overwhelmed if I don't. Your brain. Can I just take the opportunity to just thank you for taking the time to speak to me?
You're more than welcome.
I know that there was lots of interest around this topic, which further evidences the need for more people like you, not just via the private sector, but the CCG, within service. I really feel it's a progression that would be really beneficial to lots and lots and lots of children.
It is, and I think for all children, for every one of us now, I think the demands have increased for all children, and it's just understanding how that further impacts,
and how that can further benefit, which is
further benefit by being understanding and knowing as well.
Well, thank you, Scarlett, for joining.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely to have a chat as well.
No problem at all. I'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, Jenny. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.